Hey everybody, in this video we're going to take a look at chapter 33 from book 5 of Caesar's De Bello Gallico. So you might remember we're covering Ambiorix's Revolt in this book, and at this point we've seen that Caesar has spread his army out, as we've said a bunch of times. We're focusing in on that, the fort you can see the farthest to the east, basically, in the land of the Eburones. You have Ambiorix, who's tricked them into leaving. You had the debate between Sabinus and Cotta, and they finally decided they're going to leave. Sabinus really decides it, Cotta gives up. And we saw that once they leave the fort, Ambiorix knows that they left because of all the noise that was made, and he's got a trap set in a valley that the Romans have to pass through, where he's going to be able to ambush them on the sides and the front, the back, and basically trap the entire army. So at this point in the narrative, we're going to learn more about the ambush, right? It's already been set. We're going to see how it all plays out, and we're going to dive in. Well, Caesar is going to dive into the behavior of his two legates, Sabinus and Cotta, and we're going to unpack what they do, why he's telling us this, and just see how the ambush of the Gauls goes and how badly it goes for the Romans. Okay, so before we dive in, like I always tell you in these videos, the first thing that you really want to do is make sure you have the vocab down. So I would recommend looking up for a Quizlet, something, or even pre-reading, something along those lines. There's a bunch of them out there that will help you kind of understand what the words are and practice them a little bit. You can make your own, like I said, if you want to do a pre-read, but one way or another, just make sure that you know what the words are, because it's really hard to read and understand if you just don't know the vocab. So it's always the easiest thing to do. Get a Quizlet or make your own, practice it, and you'll set yourself up for a lot of success. The other thing I'd highly recommend you do is read this aloud. I know I keep saying it in all my videos, but it does help. You don't want to just translate in your head. I know sometimes if you're reading this for an AP Latin curriculum, you don't have a ton of time and everything gets pressurized, but if you can find the time, read this aloud to a partner, maybe someone in class, just anyone you can work with. That way you can work on your speaking, your pronunciation, and then when they read it back to you, you can work on your listening skills. You never want to shut those off. They'll really help you understand what's going on in the Latin. You'll start to hear it a little bit better and hopefully lock it into your more long-term memory. But you don't just want to translate in your head. That's very sort of like a short-term thing to do. It's particularly because if you are taking this for an AP test, there's a good chance you won't be reading this around the time of the AP exam. So it might be a while before the actual test, and you don't want to forget everything you did. So always take a minute, try to bring it to life. The last thing I tell you to do that will also help along those lines is the read and reread method, right? And again, I know there is a time crunch, but if you can find the time, read through this story once, write down all the problem areas you have, whether it's vocab, grammar, whatever it might be. When you're done, look at your list and try to figure out where you went wrong. The vocab is always the easiest thing to fix. You just look up the word or look up in a commentary, something like that. You'll be fine. Same with the grammar, right? Use a commentary, anything you can find to help you unpack a lot of this. There's a lot of great resources out there to help you read Caesar, but try to see where you went wrong and then go back and repeat that process, right? Read through it and make a list. If you keep doing this over and over again, hopefully your list will get shorter and shorter until you're able to finally read through this whole thing. Start to finish without writing anything down. That's mimicking what you kind of want to be able to do for an AP test. Even if you're not taking AP, you're just reading it for fun, that's the best way to actually learn it and make sure you're understanding the Latin and kind of locking into your long-term memory. It'll help you out as you go, right? The more you do that, the easier the rest of Caesar will be as you start to pick up his patterns and things like that. So I'd always recommend that you do that read and reread method. And once you hit a point where you can read it, you're probably ready to move on. Okay, so if you haven't done any of that, pause the video here, go back and do it. For the rest of the video, I'll walk you through it. I'll read the Latin to you. And again, not that my pronunciation is anything fantastic, but at least you'll get to hear it. And I'll explain kind of what's going on and we'll work through it together. But you don't want me reading it to you and kind of explaining it to be the first time you're hearing it. Okay, so work on it on your own and then use mine sort of as a double check just to make sure that you're on the right track and you should be good to go. Okay, so it starts like this. You have tum demum titorius qui nihil ante providisset trepidare et concursare cohortesque disponere, haec tamen ipsa timide atque et ut eum omnia deficere viderentur, quod plerumque eis acquirere consuevit, qui in ipso negotio consilium capere coguntur. Okay, so you have then, right, or then at last, you might say tum demum. Okay, so at last, Titorius. Now remember, Titorius here, Titorius is Sabinus. So Caesar kind of switches those names interchangeably, but it's Titorius. Okay, or rather, it's Sabinus, I should say. So what's Sabinus doing? Well, you have Sabinus who had foreseen, you could say, for providisse, right? Think like providence in English, who had foreseen nothing before, meaning he hadn't anticipated anything. So this is Caesar's commentary right off the bat. He's naming Sabinus and saying this guy did not plan for anything. He didn't think there was going to be a problem. And look at him here, right? He hadn't foreseen anything beforehand. It's kind of the idea, okay? And it's a relative clause here. I'm going with the pluperfect subjunctive. Okay, so you have Sabinus, right, who didn't plan anything out in foresight, right? In providisse, he didn't foresee everything. He began is really where you want to go. Okay, so he starts doing different things. So here you have trepidare, then you have concursare and disponere. Okay, so you have a couple of different infinitives going on here. This is what's called the historical infinitive, right? And it's used to try to give this sort of rapid sequence of events of what he did. So you'll see in different commentaries, you can basically translate these, all three of them, in like a third person singular imperfect is what a lot of them will tell you to do. And that'll work for what he's doing here. So began is something that you see a lot in those commentaries, right? So he began to hurry, right? And to run around, concursare. So he began running around, or hurrying and running around, or to do that, however you want to do it, right? And he began to arrange his cohorts, right? Disponere cohortes. So you get the sense right off the bat that Sabinus is a chicken with his head cut off, right? He's running, he's hustling, everything seems rushed because he didn't foresee this happening. He's completely caught off guard, okay? And you have that he's doing these things, or you might even go to viderentur, right? He seemed, right, to fail. So in other words, everything, omnia, everything seemed to fail him, okay? So you have the eum omnia deficere viderentur. So everything is going badly. So even before everything is failing him, you have that haec ipsa, okay? So you have, however, right, these things themselves, right, these very things, so haec ipsa, you have to supply a verb here, right, to make it make sense. A lot of times when you read through this, it makes most sense to say he did. So you could say he did these things, timide, fearfully, right? So in other words, he's afraid as he's doing these things. He's not doing it very well. He's not in command or in authority. I always think timide there really stands out, right? He's got this problem of being completely caught off guard, and he's afraid, which is not good. So he did these things fearfully, and everything seemed to fail him, meaning that, he's just making all the wrong decisions is kind of the idea. And then Caesar gives a commentary on this, right, or a comment, sort of a side note. So this is everything seemed to fail him, which generally, right, quod plerumque, which generally was accustomed, consuesit there, right, is the accustomed part, right? So which generally was accustomed to accedere, to happen to those, right, or to them, right? So in other words, he's saying everything going wrong is something that usually happens to them, meaning to people. And then he's going to explain that with the qui. So to them, or to those people who coguntur, are forced, consilium capere, to adopt a plan in ipso negotio, in the business itself, meaning like in the middle of something, in the middle of the business is kind of what it means. So Caesar's comment is, Sabinus is running around like an idiot, right? He's trying to figure out, he's completely caught off guard, and everything is going wrong. And then as a side note, Caesar says, yeah, this is what happens to people who don't plan ahead, right? So he says this is generally what happens to those who are forced to come up with a plan on the fly, right? In ipso negotio, in the middle of the business. So Caesar is making a very pointed comment that Sabinus has no idea what he's doing right now, and he's not reacting well, okay? When you get to the next line, we see how there's like a juxtaposition here, because you have at cota, qui cogitaset haec posse in itinere accidere atque ab eam causam profectionis auctor non fuisse, nulla in re communi saluti deera. Et in appellandis cohortandisque militibus imperatoris et in pugna militis officia praestaba. So you have but cauda, right? And it's a very stark juxtaposition here, right? Cotta, who had realized these things. So you have qui cogitasset haec, right? So it's Cotta. You can even say like since he had realized these things is kind of one way to do it, right? Again, going with that qui in the pluperfect subjunctive. There's a lot of commentaries that say it basically carries the sense of a cum clause, right? So you could say since, or literally you could say who, right? Had realized that these things could on the journey happen, posse in itinere acquire, right? So he realized that, again, you have the head verb there. That's where this is all kind of playing out. So Cotta realized, or who had realized, that these things could happen, posse acquire, on the journey, in itinere, right? And on account of this cause, or for this cause of eam causam, he had not been, non fuisset, the auctor. He had not been the agent of the profectionis, of the departure, meaning he hadn't been advocating for this, right? So on account of this reason, he hadn't been the auctor profectionis. So Caesar's saying that Cotta is the person who said we shouldn't leave in the first place. And since he didn't want to leave, he had been thinking that this could go really badly, right? So Cotta was always suspicious. He's planned ahead. So he's not completely caught off guard in the same way that Sabinus is. It's just an interesting, like I said, comparison, sort of looking at one commander versus the other and how different their reactions are. Okay? And then there's a comment here where he says, in nulla re, right, in no situation for the common safety, communi saluti, was lacking. So if you put that into better English, you're saying for in no situation was he lacking for the common safety. Now what that means is he's taking care of everyone, right? So in other words, he's not caught lacking in any of this, right? He knows that everyone needs to be kept safe. Cotta has a very suspicious eye, and he's keeping everyone protected, right? On the, or at least in his mind, he's thinking of how to protect everyone. It's interesting how, again, he says that because it comes off as saying that Sabinus is not doing this. Okay, and on top of that, praestabat, he was showing, meaning Cotta was showing, in appellandis, so in calling, and cohortandis, so like encouraging, right, or kind of, yeah, encouraging probably works best there, right? So in calling and encouraging his soldiers, right? These are gerundives that are modifying militibus, right? So the soldiers. So again, you can just kind of translate with the ing, and you'll get close to what you need here. So in calling and encouraging his soldiers, he was showing, right, he was kind of displaying the officia, the duty, right, the office of a imperator, right, imperatoris, of a commander, and of a soldier in pugna, in battle. So notice how Caesar's calling out the two things. He's kind of adding this interesting commentary on Cotta, saying that he's showing two things happening. It's almost like contrasting. So it's what a commander needs to do and what a soldier needs to do. So he's showing both things. He's encouraging his men, he's getting everyone ready, and he's also commanding and fighting all at once, right? So he's giving a lot of praise to Cotta here. Okay? Then you have cum propter longitudinem agminis minus facile omnia per se obire et, quid quoque loco faciendum esset, providere possent. Userunt pronuntiare ut impedimenta relinquerent, atque in orbem consisterent. Okay, so you have a cum clause here, so you're probably best off translating as since. Okay, so you have since on account of the length of the column, the longitudinem agminis. Okay, so on the because of the length of the column. Remember, they have a long column and they've been caught. Okay. So you probably need to go to the possent here to figure this out. So because of the length of the column, possent, they were able, meaning Sabinus and Cotta, to obire, to attend to everything, omnia. Per se means like on their own, through themselves. So because of the length of the column, they were able to attend, obire, to everything, minus facile, less easily, meaning they're not able to really do everything on their own because of the length of the column. And then you kind of get to the providere, and they were able to like foresee or even provide, isn't a bad way to do it. So they were able to provide what, right, quid, and in what place, quoque loco, it had to be done, right? Faciendum esset there is the passive paraphrastic. Okay, so there, the passive periphrastic, right, is the gerundive plus sum, right? It's implying or expressing that necessity, right? So that's where you get everything was going to be done or had to be done. So it's saying that they weren't able to really provide what had to be done, right? What and in what place everything had to be done. So in other words, Sabinus and Cotta are not able to really command the column well because it's so long. Okay. Then you have userunt pronuntiare, right? So you could translate this as they ordered it almost like to be announced, right? They ordered that someone announce. And it's probably like the centurions or the commanders announce something, right? Pronuntiare. And they announced that the impedimenta relinquerent, right? That they leave behind, meaning the men leave behind the impedimenta, the baggage, all their stuff, right? So since they're not able to do all this, they ordered that they command, or is kind of one way to do that, pronuntiare, right? That they leave behind, the soldiers leave behind the impedimentia, and in orbem consisterent, and that they stand, right? They ordered that they stand in a circle, in orbem. Okay, so this is going to be a defensive situation. You have the indirect command there. I'm going with the whole ordering that they stand. But this is interesting because they're making a very defensive stand. So putting your backs to each other and standing in a circle means you are completely surrounded, which makes sense because they are. But this shows you just how desperate of a situation the Roman army is in. They order this very defensive formation because they're feeling like it's the only way they're going to survive, right? Put all your stuff. Remember, they were carrying all their stuff with them. They're not ready to fight. So now the order comes out saying, drop everything, form up in a circle, and get ready to defend yourself. Okay? Then we have the next line. You have quod concilium etsi in eus modi casu reprehendendum non est, tamen incommode accidit. Okay, so this plan, right, quod concilium, again, the quote, it means like which, but you can almost, in a lot of these sentences of Caesar, translate that relative as a demonstrative, right? So you can say this plan, although, right, it must not be blamed, right? So you have that reprehendendum non est, right? It's a passive periphrastic. Again, it's expressing that necessity, but it's negative. Okay, so you have that gerundive plus sum, right? Non est. So you're saying this plan, although it must not be blamed, right? In this kind of chance, right? Or in a situation of this kind. So Caesar cuts him a little bit of slack here, right? And says, this decision, he's like, we can't really or shouldn't blame the decision given the casu, the situation, the chance, right? But, however, right, so he gives him a little slack and then he throws it back at him. He says, however, it happened disastrously, incommode accidit, right? So this plan didn't work, and Caesar's going to tell you exactly why. So it's interesting to hear the way Caesar describes this, right? Because on the one hand, he's saying, yeah, who could blame him for forming the circle? But on the other hand, he's saying it was a bad idea, right? It doesn't work out. Then it continues on and he tells you why. You have nam et nostris militibus spem minuit et hostes ad pugnam alacriores effecit, quod non sine sumo timore et desperatione id factum videbator. Okay? For our soldiers, right? So you have the et. So there's two things happening. So both, one, minuit, it lessened. What did it lessen? The spem, the hope for our soldiers. So the first thing this circle formation did is it lowered the hope for the Roman soldiers, right? Which is not good. And two, right, two, it effacit, it made the hostes, the enemy, alacriores, more eager, is kind of one way to do it, ad pugnam, for battle, right? So it made the Gauls even more excited to fight them, right? To get out there and kind of fight the Romans, okay? Why did it have this effect? He tells you, because, quote, it seemed, right, to have been done. So videbator, right, it seemed that it factum esse there is really what you're looking at. It's a perfect passive infinitive going with videbator. So it seemed to have been done is kind of one way to do it. not without, non sine, the summo timore et desperatione, without the greatest fear and the greatest desperation, right? So that's really what Caesar's point is. This was a very desperate move, right? So the Roman army, felt that this was a desperation move. So imagine if your commander says get in a circle, you're thinking, oh my God, it's that bad, we're screwed. It's going to lower your hope. If you're the Gauls and you see this happening, you're thinking, all right, we're doing pretty well. Look, they're making a defensive formation. We've got them on the run, right where we want them. We're gonna kill them all because now they're stuck. That's the impact that it had. Okay. And again, he doesn't really blame anyone, but he sort of blames them. Then you have praeterea acide, quod fieri necesse erat, ut vulgo milites ab signis discederent, quae quisque eorum carissima haberet, ab impedimentis petere atque aripere properaret, clamore et fletu omnia complerentur. Okay, so you have praeterea, moreover, or besides, accidit, it happened that, right? So he's telling you what else kind of happened because of all this. Okay, so you have the quod fieri necesse erat. You're saying it happened, right? It happened that which was necessary to happen, meaning everyone knew what the outcome was going to be, okay, because of all this. So what happened? Well, it happened, the things that happened that commonly vulgo, right? Milites, the soldiers, discederant, they were leaving, right? It almost means like fleeing from their standards, ab signis. So this is an important part of the story here because it shows the confusion. So these are the military standards, which are basically flags, which helps organize the army, and you know where you're supposed to be. You might remember in book 4, if you've been reading it, Caesar mentioned these when they're doing the invasion of Britain as a rally point, right? And you have in that book the soldiers running to whatever standard they can find, and it doesn't matter. Here, they're basically running away from it, and it's just mass confusion, right? So they're not staying with their standards. Everyone's confused, and it's all getting sort of jumbled up. Okay, so the thing that happened is exactly what you thought would happen, right? That the soldiers commonly, right, so everywhere, they were running away or leaving their standards, right? And that you have they were hurrying. So you probably want to go to properare there, right? So they were hurrying to grab aripere. So everyone was hurrying to grab and to see petere the well, you want to go to quae. So what were they grabbing? They were grabbing that which each of them, right, quisque eorum, each of them held dearest, carissime haberet, right? So they were hurrying to grab and to look for the things which each of them held dearest ab impedimentis, from the baggage, right? So they're going back and they're trying to find all their prized possessions because they think they're going to die. And then he ends with this sort of sad line when he says complerentur, right? Omnia complerentur, everything or all things were being filled with clamore, with shouting and weeping, fletu, right? Clamore et fletu. And that's how the chapter ends. So things are going horribly wrong for the Roman army, right? So things are not going great. And you can see there's chaos, there's confusion, men dying, and just everything turning into sort of a jumbled mess and not going well for the Romans because they're completely ambushed and caught off guard. Okay, so some things to think about just to kind of tie this all together. You want to notice that Caesar starts the chapter by naming Sabinus. Right off the bat, he goes at Sabinus and he describes him as being basically totally incompetent, right? He has no idea what he's doing. He's running around like an idiot. He's not effective as a leader. That goes in stark contrast to Cotta, which I mentioned in the second bullet point, right? Cotta is the counter to Sabinus. Which one do you think Caesar favored? It's Cotta, right? And I know he doesn't necessarily like either of them for the actions they've done, but you've seen throughout, book 5, Cotta has had sort of the right logic. Even the argument before, not wanting to leave, Caesar has propped him up as the guy doing the right thing, and now we're seeing it again. Cotta is doing things well and Sabinus isn't. So you want to read that description of Cotta carefully, right? And it'll give you a little bit of insight into how Caesar feels about him. And the question I would say, does it match the previous descriptions we've gotten of Cotta? In some ways, yes, and in some ways, no, right? So Cotta has never been a big fan of doing this, but here he goes. He's being a great commander and taking control. The interesting thing I would say, it's kind of an open-ended question, is where was this with Cotta during the debate? And I know he fought Sabinus and finally he gave up, but it is interesting to see that the last thing we really saw about Cotta is he gave up and made the mistake of letting Sabinus win the argument, and now here he is taking control of the army when Sabinus is doing nothing. So Cotta is sort of an interesting character to look at here. Okay, Caesar's description of the circle tactic, we talked about that. It's interesting. He's acknowledging that it wouldn't necessarily be a bad idea in other situations, but that it is in this situation, right? How would Sabinus and Cotta have possibly known it would be a bad idea? That's kind of the interesting thing. So on the one hand, he's saying it's not the worst idea in the world, but on the other hand, he is criticizing it, right? And the reason he's criticizing it is he's saying it hurt our troops and it helped the enemy, right? How would he know that in the moment? This is hindsight. So what does this imply about Caesar? It comes off as Caesar saying, I wouldn't have done that, right? You guys are lucky I wasn't there. I would have handled this differently. That's a nice way of having hindsight, right? Anyone would have handled it differently if you know what's going to happen. But Caesar's definitely, at least in my opinion, using this as a moment to kind of prop himself up, because when you read his description of why Sabinus and Cotta were wrong, it implies that he would have been right, okay? And he wasn't there, so it's kind of an easy thing to say. The last thing I'd say is, why do you think Caesar ends the chapter with this description of his troops? So you might have noticed that he leaves Sabinus and Cotta behind, and he's focusing specifically on the Romans. They're the ones who have their hope lessened. They're the ones who are kind of abandoned by Sabinus. They're surrounded by the Gauls. It's desperate, right? There's great desperation and there's fear. Everything seems to be going bad. They're running around. Everything is chaotic. They're looking for their sort of favorite things from the baggage because they expect they're going to die. And then that sort of dramatic line, which says everything was filled with shouting and weeping. Caesar wouldn't have known all this. I mean, I guess if he asked somebody, but he's definitely adding this for a dramatic effect. And I think the reason he's doing this is to make you feel bad for his soldiers, right? And to show the impact that Sabinus and Cotta, particularly Sabinus, and their bad decision is having on the common soldiers. Caesar will always prop up his men whenever he can. And you're going to see in the next chapter he keeps doing that. But he wants you to feel bad for his soldiers because he really sort of empathizes with them over his commanders, because that's his whole point, right? He wants their support, and he constantly wants to portray himself as sort of a leader who loves his men and would take care of them, which he probably was as well. But it's not lost here that he is kind of making a very dramatic part of the narrative here focused on his soldiers, which he's done in previous chapters too, right? He always wants you to feel bad for the soldiers because they didn't want to be here. And now look what happened to them. Okay. If you have any questions at all on the translation or anything like that, put it in the comments below. I'm always happy to help you. Again, my translation and pronunciation, everything like that is never perfect. It's just to give you a guidepost. So if you hear something, you're like, wait, what's going on? Just put it in the comments and I'll explain it to you, and hopefully explain it better than I did in the video. But either way, if what I'm putting in here matches what you were able to do, you could probably feel pretty good that you're ready to move on from the chapter and that you've understood it. But always make sure that you're going back, you're reading, you're rereading, you're speaking this aloud. Try to bring it all together so you can really understand what's happening in this chapter. Okay. And if you're, like I said, if you hit that point where you feel good, you're ready to move on. Good luck.